Truth is, I thought it mattered. I thought that
money
mattered. But does it bollocks? Not compared to how people matter.
Welcome, mention, and other fine folks to the Someday Dispatch of the Black Letter, where we contemplate thoughts worth thinking as we try to navigate through this upside-down, topsy-turvy world that hopefully will straighten itself out in due time, and we'll be able to have greater success in the future than we are experiencing right now. That's the hope and the goal. And so to do that, we need to be looking past the smoke and mirrors, peeking behind the curtain to see who's actually the puppet masters pulling the puppet strings, so that we can make appropriate decisions to safeguard our wealth and value and investing decisions, so we can come out on the other side healthier, wealthier, and wiser. That's the goal, at least I'm trying to push forward to for myself. So today we've got a bunch on the go, actually, but just a couple things really that we're going to talk about, but they're long articles, this one especially, but it is terrific, one of the best articles I've read about Bitcoin ever, actually. So let's get to it. We'll see how much else we can get through. But I thought today on Saturday, let's take a moment to really understand why Bitcoin is perhaps such a powerful idea, and arguably whose time has come as well. So in Medium, Robert Breedlove, who I saw actually interviewed on the Pump podcast, a terrific guy, very erudite and well-spoken, and a big fan, obviously, of Bitcoin, as you can tell as we'll go through this. This is an exceptionally long article. I'm going to try and tease out some of the main highlighted points here that I've highlighted, but I do encourage you to read the whole thing. It certainly is worthwhile if you're interested in Bitcoin and just want to understand it a little bit more and why it is such a transformative idea, really. Okay, the number zero and a Bitcoin. Satoshi gave the world Bitcoin, a true something for nothing. His discovery of absolute scarcity for money is an unstoppable idea that is changing the world tremendously, just like its digital ancestor, the number zero. And so basically the crux of this article is basically seeing how zero was so transformative for mathematics, and Bitcoin will be so transformative for money or currency or store of value, if you will, and how it will have huge repercussions for society generally in the positive. Zero is special. In the history of culture, the discovery of zero will always stand out as one of the greatest single achievements of the human race. Tobias Danzig, Number, the Language of Science. Many believe that Bitcoin is just one of thousands of crypto assets. This is true in the same way that the number zero is just one of an infinite series of numbers. In reality, Bitcoin is special, and so is zero. Each is an invention which led to a discovery and that fundamentally reshaped its overarching system. For Bitcoin, that system is money, and for zero, it is mathematics. For most of history, mankind had no concept of zero. Zero is an abstract conception and is not discernible in the physical world. For example, no one goes shopping for 0 apples. Zero is really a void, it's an emptiness, right? And he talks about this a little bit later, and how it ties in with Eastern philosophy, really, which is where we got the number zero from India originally, perhaps Cambodia as well. There's some, but primarily from India is probably the most well-known case of where we got zero from. And it's an abstract conception, as he says, and it's that emptiness, that void, that sort of Buddhist idea of nothingness, if you will, but it's crucially an important concept. Numerals, which are symbols for numbers, are the greatest abstractions ever invented by mankind. Virtually everything we interact with is best grasped in numerical, quantifiable, or digital form. And I would definitely agree with that. Everything is really centered around numbers. Our whole society really at large is. How old are you? How tall are you? How much money do you make? What grade are you in? These are all numbers, right? Math, the language of numerals, originally developed from a practical desire to count things. And the Babylonians, who failed to conceptualize a zero, started off with their one of the earliest forms of numeral writing. As you can see it here, it's quite interesting. So this is worth 10. So 59 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of these 10s. And then this is a row of 3, and this is 9, right? 3 rows of 3. So you get 59. It's quite interesting, but they don't have 0, so there's a problem, right? And here you can see the Bakhshali manuscript, which contains pages dating back to the 3rd or 4th centuries AD, the first known written 0. And then there's also another example in the 7th century in Cambodia. It was discovered in the 19th century, but it's from the 7th century in Cambodia. In the 7th century, the Indian mathematician Brahmagupta developed terms for 0 in addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. It was this Western advance of zero which ultimately led to the inception of the Hindu-Arabic numeral system. As you can see here, this is how it sort of evolved to where we are currently right now. The economization of math. When zero reached Europe roughly 300 years later in the High Middle Ages, it was met with strong ideological resistance. Obviously, because that was something new, something we weren't familiar with. Roman numerals had been doing just fine up until that point, so why change it? But of course, zero is an idea whose time had come, and it makes everything so much easier. It makes math easier. Not only that, it enhances math. You can't have calculus, I think, as he goes on here later, without zero, for example. And zero is so crucial to math. I mean, you can't have negative numbers without zero, really. It's the fulcrum upon which the infinite amount of numbers rests, both to the left and to the right, so to the negative and the positive, right? Whereas here's how you sum 1223 plus 1104, right, using Roman numerals, and it's quite complex. Calculation performed using the Hindu-Arabic system is significantly more straightforward than with Roman numerals, obviously. And here he talks about Amir Axel. The Hindu-Arabic numeral system allowed an immense economy of notation so that the same digit, for example 4, can be used to convey itself, or 40, when followed by 0, or 404 when written as 404, or 4000 when written as a 4 followed by 3 zeros. The power of the Hindu-Arabic numeral system is incomparable, as it allows us to represent numbers efficiently and compactly, enabling us to perform complicated arithmetic calculations that could not have been easily done before. Like its distant progeny, Bitcoin would later be, zero was an unstoppable idea whose time has come, as I've mentioned. And, you don't have to be a mathematician to really understand this article. It's very well written. I certainly am not a mathematician. In fact, I never did very well at math, beyond sort of the rudimentary aspects of perhaps grade 9 math or so. But beyond that, calculus and all these other sorts of things, geometry, and that geometry wasn't bad, but some of the other abstract mathematical concepts seem to elude me. Not how my brain works, but I could still appreciate the ideas he's sharing here and how important they are, and how important math is as well. Functions of zero. Zero's first function is as a placeholder in our numeric system. For instance, notice the 0 in the number 1104 in the equation above, which indicates the absence of value in the tens place. Now he starts to go into how Buddhism and Eastern philosophy helped develop the idea of zero. This is from Lao Tzu. We shape clay into a pot, but it is the emptiness inside that holds whatever we want. And really, that's sort of true with value, zero, right? It's that placeholder. It holds that space as being empty, but it's an important space to be held, right? More philosophically, zero is emblematic of the void, as Axel describes it. Zero is the store of value on which a higher order of magnitude numerals can scale. Zero's second function is as a number in its own right. It is the midpoint between any positive number and its negative counterpart, sort of that fulcrum I was mentioning earlier, right? Zero is the fulcrum upon which the infinite number of numbers, both to the negative and positive, rest. Interestingly, negative numbers were originally used to signify debts. By going below zero and conceptualizing negative numbers, many new and unusual, yet extremely useful mathematical constructs come into being, including imaginary numbers, complex numbers, fractals, and advanced astrophysical equations. So this is why, the zero is so powerful, and this is a fractal, obviously. The Mandelbrot set, one of the most famous examples of a fractal, a mind-bending mathematical structure formed with complex numbers that models the geometry of nature and its intrinsic complexity. And it says here, zero is a necessary prerequisite to such fractal modeling. Zero's third function is as a facilitator for fractions or ratios. With zero, we can easily convert fractions to decimal form, like 1/2 to 0.5. Prices expressed in money are just exchange ratios converted into a money-denominated price decimal. So instead of saying this house costs 11 cars, we say this house costs $440,000, which is equal to the price of 11 $40,000 cars. Numbers are the ultimate level of objective abstraction. I encourage you to read, this article as well to really get to the sort of the meat of what he's sort of expressing. I'm just sort of giving you some of the highlights of what he's talking about that were, I thought, quite important to me to give you a sense of what this article is about. An ability to more efficiently handle ratios directly contributed to mankind's later development of rationality, a logic-based way of thinking at the root of major social movements such as the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment. So what we're sort of talking about here is how zero was not only crucial or fundamentally important in mathematics, of course, and to get where we are in technological revolution and evolutions, if you will, but zero is crucially important in a whole realm of human activities. So for here, we're talking about philosophy and logic, and further down he talks about art and how zero or infinity is important for art as well. Zero arose from the bizarre logic of the ancient East. Interestingly, the Buddha himself was a known mathematician, and it talks about some of these these Zen sort of koans, if you will, like what is the sound of one hand clapping, etc., etc. The ultimate goal of meditation is the attainment of enlightenment. Achievement of this absolute emptiness is the state of being in shunyata. And so zero is emptiness, right? So enlightenment and zero, one could argue, are practically the same thing. And so I think that's why I took this Eastern philosophy, this deep Eastern understanding of perhaps nirvana or enlightenment or the sense of nothingness, the void, and also everything being interconnected, because as we spoke about earlier, zero connects all numbers along a line, or the infinite amount of numbers, right? As does the absolute interconnectedness of everything. When we meditate, we count. We close our eyes and are aware only of where we are at the moment and nothing else. We count breathing in 1 and we count breathing out 2, and we go on this way. When we stop counting, that is the void, the number 0, the emptiness. Zero arose in the ancient East as the epitome of this deeply philosophical and experiential concept of absolute emptiness, as I mentioned, right? Despite being discovered in a spiritual state, zero is a profoundly practical concept. By traversing across zero into the territory of negative numbers, we encounter the imaginary numbers, which have a base unit of the square root of -1, denoted by the letter I. The number I is paradoxical, and he talks about this a little bit more for those of you who enjoy mathematics. This was a little bit dense for me, but he makes very good points for sure. Importantly, zero gave us the concept of infinity, which was notably absent from the minds of ancient Greek logicians, and he talks about the Riemann sphere here. You can see zero on one side of the sphere and infinity on the other. And then talks about scaling the real and imaginary number planes into the third dimension. We discover zero's twin, infinity, right? The opposite of zero is infinity. Zero and infinity always look suspiciously alike. Multiply zero by anything and you get zero. Multiply infinity by anything and you get infinity. Dividing a number by zero yields infinity. Dividing a number by infinity yields a zero. Adding zero to a number leaves it unchanged. Adding a number to infinity leaves infinity unchanged. I mean, these are very esoteric but deeply profound ideas, right? In Eastern philosophy, the kinship of zero and infinity made sense. Only in a state of absolute nothingness can possibility become infinite. Buddhist logic insists that everything is endlessly intertwined. And that's the idea. Zero and infinity make sense together, right? Because when you're in that state of nothingness or enlightenment, that absence of anything really is pretty much all potentiality is out there, right? At that moment, in that void where there is nothing, there is also the potential for everything, in a sense. Nibbana, the ultimate spiritual goal in Buddhism, is attained by entering the void in meditation. This is where zero was discovered. And in that void, as I said, is everything as well, right? And I think, you have to be a meditator to really understand that concept. It's very, as I said, esoteric, quite abstract and to understand and difficult to really appreciate unless you can capture those fleeting moments in meditation where you just, for the briefest fraction of a second, and of course many people are better at this, you capture that moment of sense of nothingness and at the same time infinity. It's a very difficult concept to explain just talking about with words. Words are perhaps not as robust as we would like in order to explain some of these philosophical abstractions, but there you have it. In those moments when you grasp that void, that sense of enlightenment, where there is nothingness, there is also that potentiality for everything and infinity. Zero was liberation discovered deep in meditation, a remnant of truth found in close proximity to nirvana, a place where one encounters universal, unbounded, and infinite awareness, God's kingdom within us. Exactly. Zero would prove to be a critical piece of infrastructure that led to the interconnection of the world via telecommunications, which ushered in the gold standard and the digital age, Bitcoin's two key inceptors many years later. The twin conceptions of zero and infinity would ignite the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment, as we mentioned earlier. It was just a mind-bogglingly, crucially important idea whose time had come and who we really just didn't realize what we were missing until it was well established and entrenched. And I think that'll be the same thing with Bitcoin. In the decades to come, it becomes so mundane, if you will, and pedestrian that we have Bitcoin, this most scarce, hard money, that the idea of never having had it would seem obscene, perhaps, in many ways. That's really what I think I'm getting away from this. Because Bitcoin also is it's an idea whose time has come, and it's going to, I think, it's going to just capture the world's attention at some point. Zero posed a major threat to the conception of a finite universe. Dividing by zero is devastating to the framework of logic, and thus threatened the perfect order and integrity of a Pythagorean worldview, because the ancient Greeks and Romans didn't have this conception of zero, and it was quite detrimental to the church, as we'll see, the Catholic Church, which at that point was sort of the most powerful entity in the world, even more powerful than governments at that time. In fact, it was practically ruling the governments. Standing as a symbol for both the void and the infinite, zero was heretical to the church. Centuries later, a similar dynamic would unfold in the discovery of absolute scarcity for money, which is dissident to the dominion of the Fed, the false church of modernity. Absolutely. Amen, brother. In the Aristotelian concept of the universe, the force moving the stars, which drove the motion of all the elements below, was the prime mover, God. And so this was part of the difficulty in, I think, what folks had in understanding zero, because it sort of was a concept that really, I think, rattled the minds of the philosophers and the religious leaders at the time. They couldn't really get behind it, perhaps. And here he talks about perhaps some of those reasons. An infinite universe meant there were at least a vast multitude of planets, many of which likely had their own populations and churches. Earth was no longer the center of the universe, so why would the church have universal dominion? And there's the crux of the matter, right? With zero comes the possibility of infinity, as mentioned, and with infinity becomes the possibility that we are not all that unique. Zero became the idea that broke the church's grip on humanity, just as absolute scarcity of money, which is, i.e. Bitcoin, is breaking the Fed's stranglehold on the world today. One can only hope, and I believe it's true. I believe it will come. And I mean, I really believe what Breedlove is saying here, that this is really as fundamentally an important breakthrough Bitcoin is as the zero was. And I think we will only be able to notice that in hindsight, except for those of us who perhaps are aware of this and see the potential. Of course, it's early days, it's risky still. There's no guarantee that Bitcoin will survive, but the longer it goes on, the stronger it gets in surviving all sorts of calamities. I think it's probably going to be around for centuries to come, I imagine. Zero was the smooth stone slung into the face of Goliath, a death stroke to the dominion of the church, felled by an unstoppable idea. This oppressive institution's fall from grace would make way for the rise of the nation-state, the dominant institutional model in modernity. Zero is an ideological juggernaut, but zero's capacity to support honest weights and measures, a core biblical concept, would prove more important than the countermeasures of the church. And the invention of zero would later lead to the invention of the most infallible of weights and measures, the most honest money in history, which is Bitcoin. In a world being built on trade, merchants needed zero for its superior arithmetic utility. And this is about the idea, the concept of an idea whose time has come, right? It's just unstoppable. Pierre-Simon Laplace said, "Zero is a profound and important idea which appears so simple to us now that we ignore its true merit. But its very simplicity and the great ease which it lent to all computations put our arithmetic in the first rank of useful inventions." And I think the same will happen with Bitcoin, as I said, right, in hindsight. The point about zero is that we do not need to use it in the operations of daily life. No one goes out to buy zero fish. It is in a way the most civilized of all the cardinals, and its use is only forced on us by the needs of cultivated modes of thought. Cardinals are, I think, just positive integers or positive numbers. Let's see. Okay, here we go. So cardinal numbers say how many of something there are, such as 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. They answer the question how many. So I think there are all the positive numbers, right? Because I don't think you can count. I don't think you can, well, you can't conceptualize negative numbers. There's nothing is negative. There's just an emptiness of it, right? So it's not really useful in day-to-day living. So the cardinal numbers, I think they would be positive numbers. Let's see if we can get a better example here. Let's see what it says here. Okay, so cardinal numbers says how many. Ordinal numbers tell us the position, so that's fifth, second, etc. Nominal numbers is a number used only as a name. So that's helpful, but it doesn't say. Let's see if there's anything else. Yeah, in common usage, a cardinal number is a number used in counting, so it looks like it's only positive integers. But perhaps those of you who know better, well, mathematicians can tell me if I'm wrong or not. But there you go. So that's about numbers, basically. And he talks about here how originally we had the abacus was used, the abacists, in order to perform calculations. And then along came the algorists who used the Hindu-Arabic numeral system with a 0. And then with training, algorists could readily outpace abacists in computation. Contests like this led to the demise of the abacus as a useful tool. However, it still left a lasting mark. And so there's a lot of little interesting historical tidbits here. So for example, the words calculate, calculus, and calcium are all derived from the Latin word for pebble, which is calculus. And of course, an abacus uses pebbles in order to count and do addition, I believe. And then he talks also about the Reichenbach, and the Germans called the counting board, which is to keep flows, track of value flows. And then it was also not just the Reichenbach. Not only did banks use counting boards, but they also used tally sticks to keep track of lending activities. The monetary value of a loan was written on the side of a stick, and it was split into two pieces, with the lender keeping the larger piece, known as the stock, which is where we get the term stockholder. So I thought that was quite interesting. I didn't know that. And so this is what the tally stick looks like. And the lender, you or me, borrowing from the bank, would keep the larger piece. And I think once you had paid back the loan, you would bring this back and they would destroy it, obviously. At least that's my understanding of how that used to work. Zero had been adapted as an artistic tool to create the vanishing point. And here he talks about art as well, being important for zero. And of course, trade, we were just talking about, and economics, not just purely mathematics. And here, zero is important as it is adapted as an artistic tool to create the vanishing point, again, that point of infinity, if you will, an acute place of infinite nothingness used in many paintings that sparked the great Renaissance in the visual arts. Drawings and paintings prior to the vanishing point appear flat and lifeless, and so here's an example of that, right? There's no sort of the vanishing point, so there's no sense of three-dimensionality really within this painting as compared to this one down here, of course, is a classic with the vanishing point and gives you a sense that you can actually step into the picture. It has that 3D, the three-dimensionality to it. It was no coincidence that zero and infinity are linked in the vanishing point. Just as multiplying by zero causes the number line to collapse into a point, the vanishing point has caused most of the universe to sit in a tiny dot. This is a singularity, a concept that became very important later in the history of science, but at this early stage, mathematicians knew little more than the artists about the properties of zero. And now we get to the modernity, the ages of ones and zeros. Eventually, zero became the cornerstone of calculus, an innovative system of mathematics that enabled people to contend with ever smaller units approaching zero, but cunningly avoided the logic trap of having to divide by zero. Zero serves as the source waters of many technological breakthroughs. Today, Bitcoin is punching a hole and creating a vacuum in the market for money. It is killing Keynesian economics. All modern miracles made possible by digital technologies can be traced back to the invention of a figure for numeric nothingness by an ancient Indian mathematician, Brahmagupta. Numbers are our greatest invention, and zero is the capstone of the whole system. And this is Axel again, as we heard from earlier. A common misconception of Bitcoin is that it is just one of the thousands of crypto assets in the world today. And now we start to talk about Bitcoin and why Bitcoin is perhaps not only the granddaddy of them all, but perhaps the only one that will potentially survive. Now, I don't believe that Breedlove is a Bitcoin maximalist. I'm not, but I do believe that Bitcoin is probably the safest bet in this space, and it's certainly the largest component of all the cryptocurrencies that I own. Many mistakenly believe that Bitcoin could be disrupted by any one of the thousands of alternative crypto assets in the marketplace today, and he's going to go on to explain why that is most unlikely. Disruption of Bitcoin is extremely unlikely. Bitcoin is a path-dependent, one-time invention. Its critical breakthrough is the discovery of absolute scarcity, a monetary property never before and never again achievable by mankind. And I'll just take a moment here just to sort of define this sort of concept. So basically what he's saying and what he'll sort of allude to and enunciate further down is the fact that Bitcoin created this idea of hard money, of true scarcity, where eventually we only get 21 million Bitcoins totally will be mined, right, by the middle of next century. And after that point, as he talks about, this Dr. Flow model of Bitcoin will head to infinity because there will be no more Bitcoin ever being able to be mined or reproduced, right? And so this is a one-time critical breakthrough, right? You can only do something like this. Such a profound idea can only be given birth once. And of course, now if you try to come up with a Bitcoin killer, everybody's aware of this fact, this idea of this absolute scarcity, and of proof of work as Bitcoin uses to transact with or to create its blockchain. This can only be done once. And so if you try to come up with a new Bitcoin now, it would be so easily attacked that it would be basically worthless. So Bitcoin has that first mover advantage, which I think in this sphere, this particular idea or this ideology is not only fundamentally important, but crucially important as well. What numeral is to number and zero is to the void for mathematics, Bitcoin is to absolute scarcity for money. So the path dependence of Bitcoin. Path dependence is the sensitivity of an outcome to the order of events that led to it. So for example, he talks about this here. You get a dramatically different result if you shower and then dry yourself off versus if you dry yourself off first and then shower, and that's path dependence. Path dependence is especially prevalent in complex systems due to their high interconnectivity and numerous, often unforeseeable, interdependencies. Bitcoin was launched into the world as a one-of-a-kind technology, a non-state digital money that is issued on a perfectly fixed, diminishing, and predictable schedule. And here's Bitcoin's hash rate. And the higher the hash rate, the stronger and more hack-proof, if you will, Bitcoin is. Path dependence protects Bitcoin from disruption as the organic sequence of events which led to its release and assimilation into the marketplace cannot be replicated. And that's what I was sort of trying before. If you try to come up with a new Bitcoin, it'll be so easily attacked because everybody knows and understands what Bitcoin is now. Further, Bitcoin's money supply is absolutely scarce, as we know. The idea of absolute monetary scarcity goes against the wishes of entrenched power structures like the Fed, because of course it takes them out of the whole equation, right? No longer do we need the Fed if we have Bitcoin. It talks about finite and infinite games. From a moral perspective, sovereignty is always superior to tyranny, and from a practical perspective, tyrannies are less energy efficient than free markets because they require tyrants to expend resources enforcing compliance with their imposed rule sets and protecting their turf. So basically, because Bitcoin is more energy efficient, and I know this is a difficult concept to grasp because it uses so much electricity and energy to create and to, prove these equations in order for the new blockchain to be accepted. It uses a lot of electricity for that purpose, but yet it's still more energy efficient than the fiat currency, but also the energy efficiency of taking away all the entrenched actors within the fiat currency regime, right? The central bankers and all the government officials and all the economists that are having to try and figure out how much money is out there and how it's working, etc., etc. Bitcoin solves all those problems, so it's much more energy efficient from that perspective as well. Bitcoin's terminal money supply growth, inflation, rate of absolute zero is the ultimate monetary Schelling point. And the Schelling point is a game theoretic focal point that people tend to choose in an adversarial game. In game theory, a game in any situation where there can be winners or losers, the strategy is a decision-making process, and a Schelling point is the default strategy for games in which the players cannot fully trust one another, like money. Holding the scarcest money is the most energy-efficient strategy a player can employ, which makes the absolute scarcity of Bitcoin an irrefutable Schelling point. A distant digital descendant of zero, the invention of Bitcoin represents the discovery of absolute scarcity for money, an idea as equally unstoppable. So here it talks about the 5 critical traits of money, which is divisibility, which is also known as fungibility, durability, portability, recognizability, and scarcity. We'll keep those 5 traits in mind as we read further down here. Digitalization is advantageous across all 5 traits of money. Since Bitcoin is just information relative to other monetary technologies, we can say its divisibility is supreme, as information can be infinitely subdivided and recombined at near zero cost, like numbers. Its durability is supreme, as information does not decompose. Books can outlast empires. Its portability is supreme, as information can move at the speed of light, thanks to telecommunications. And its recognizability is supreme, as information is the most objectively discernible substance in the universe, like the written word. Finally, and most critically, since Bitcoin algorithmically and thermodynamically enforces an absolute scarce money supply, we can say that its scarcity is infinite. As scarce as time, the substance money is intended to tokenize in the first place. Taken in combination, these traits make absolute scarce digital money seemingly indomitable in the marketplace, and I would agree with that. So this is an important point here. He talks about that Bitcoin algorithmically enforces an absolute scarce money supply. We can say that its scarcity is infinite, as scarce as time. So scarcity is infinite because there is only going to be these 21 million. Time is scarce because eventually the universe will collapse in on itself again. So on the big picture, that's true. More importantly, from the individual perspective, time is scarce. It's the only non-renewable resource we have, right? We will all get, 70 years or whatever it is, as the Bible said. So roughly 80 years or so, if you're fortunate, perhaps more, on this planet. And what we spend most of our time doing is exchanging it for money, right? So we can live, we can buy things that we need, necessities as well as small luxuries. So if time is scarce, and we know that time is a hard time, if you will, Bitcoin is a hard money. So wouldn't it make more sense that we should exchange our time, which is as scarce as Bitcoin, for Bitcoin and not for some fiat currency that any jamoke can print willy-nilly if he gets into a central bank, right? So if time is so scarce, then we need a money that represents our time, really, because, as you said earlier, money is just a way to transact value through time and space, right? And so time is scarce, we need a money that is scarce. I think this idea is just, its time has come. And here's the pristine predictability of Bitcoin creates reflexivity without precedent. Few will understand this until it's too late. So you can see what happens is that this is going to probably continue to prove out to be this way, which means here you can see this number here at the top is 1 million. And in sort of roughly by about, well, this is 2026 maybe, each Bitcoin will be worth roughly around 1 million if this stock to flow model holds, right? And here we can see a better picture of it, right? 1 million stock to flow daily US dollar value of Bitcoin. That's where it was. So this was just before the second halving, because this ended about 2019. You can see how it's generally been following along that trending. And so we expect to see Bitcoin hit around 100,000 towards the end of 2021, and perhaps hit 1 million somewhere around 2025, perhaps 2024. According to this, who knows if it'll work, but that's the idea. In summary, the invention of Bitcoin represents the discovery of absolute scarcity, or absolute irreproducibility, which occurred due to a particular sequence of idiosyncratic events that cannot be reproduced. Exactly, it's sort of an idea that is a one-off, it can only be done once, because now everybody's onto it, right? As I said, you can't create another Bitcoin because it'll be disrupted and hacked. Scarcity is the trait of money that allows it to hold value across time, enabling us to trade it with our future selves for the foregone opportunity cost, the things we would have otherwise traded money for had we not decided to hold it. Scarce money accrues value as our productivity grows. Bitcoin was specifically designed as a countermeasure to expansionary monetary policies. As you know, it was started just after the last financial crisis we had around 2008-2009, right? Bitcoin was specifically designed as a countermeasure to expansionary monetary policies, aka wealth confiscation via inflation by central bankers. Bitcoin is a true 0-to-1 invention, an innovation that profoundly changes society instead of just introducing an incremental advancement. Most importantly, it promises to break the cycle of criminality in which governments continuously privatize gains via seigniorage, and seigniorage is basically the government's ability to print money, and socialize losses via inflation. Time and time again, excessive inflation has torn societies apart, yet the lessons of history remain unlearned. And this is incredibly, crucially important right now as we're going through this difficult period of time in the economy. We need to have a reset and have a money system based on hard money, ideally Bitcoin. But nevertheless, you don't have to rely on your government or central banks to help you out with it. You can start getting into the Bitcoin realm right now as a store of value. And that's what I'm doing. None of this is financial advice, of course. Inflation rate and societal well-being are inversely related. So in other words, the lower the inflation, the better off society is. When Bitcoin's inflation rate finally reaches a zero in the mid-22nd century, the measure of its soundness as a store of value, the stock-to-flow ratio, will become infinite, which means there is no telling what Bitcoin's value will become. People that realize this and adopt it early will benefit disproportionately from the resultant mass wealth transfer. And I have to agree with Breedlove here. I think we're going to see probably the biggest wealth transfer in our lifetimes, probably during this next 10 years, this decade, I would imagine. And Bitcoin's going to play a huge role in that, probably the biggest role. Only unstoppable ideas can break otherwise immovable institutions. The zero brought the church to its knees, and Bitcoin is bringing the false church of the Fed into the sunlight of its long-awaited Judgment Day. Amen, brother. Everything is nothing, zero with a twist. So there you go, folks. I really encourage you to read this. It's terrific, by Robert Breedlove here. March 28th, just as we were in the midst of the biggest, probably, market correction at the time. A very interesting article. In fact, I'm going to print it off and save it as a PDF because it's a fantastic, probably the best article I've read on Bitcoin so far. Okay, and then I just wanted to go over the Cantillon effect earlier, because, I mean, not earlier, but now, because he talks about the Cantillon effect here as well, which is an important concept to understand as far as monetary systems. So it says here, Richard Cantillon was an economist in the 18th century who mainly wrote about money and how it circles around the economy. The so-called Cantillon effect describes the uneven expansion of the amount of money. If a central bank pumps more money into the economy, the resulting increase in prices does not happen evenly. So generally what happens, in case of a monetary expansion, the ones who profit from it are the ones who are close to the money. Close to the money in this case means everyone who can access the money right in the beginning, that is the big companies, banks, hedge fund managers, etc., etc. Prices then start to rise as they start to use this money, even though the rest of the population has not received any of the new money yet. And so what happens is inflation, and those of us who are not close to the money have our wealth confiscated basically through this inflation. The result is a redistribution from the poor to the rich. Central banks which try to control the amount of money in the economy are the reason for this redistribution of money. But why is this effect so crucial? The reason is that this phenomenon has been completely ignored by groups and parties on the left. And interestingly here, he says that central banks was advocated by Karl Marx in his Communist Manifesto. I didn't know that. Central banks have been one of the main institutions established by the left in the last 2 centuries. Nowadays, central banks are a given. Almost nobody questions them. Inflation would also exist without central banks, but it would definitely be not as high. So there you have it, folks. Okay, this has been a super long, but I thought it was really important. This number zero in Bitcoin was crucial. It's just an imperatively important article to read, in my opinion, if you really want to understand Bitcoin and why it is so important to a better, more egalitarian, more equal society. So really encourage you again to read that, folks. Now let's take a look at the markets. Of course, the markets aren't being aren't open today on Saturday, but I wanted to see if they were up for the week, and I have a tendency to think that they were all up marginally over this past week. So let's have a look here with the S&P 500 index. Yeah, it was up on the week, about 0.39%. And here's the NASDAQ again, up 2.7% in a week. I mean, this is just astonishing. Can you imagine it did that every week? It would be over 100% increase per year. Just amazing how this continues to defy gravity. And here's the Dow Jones. Okay, interestingly, the Dow Jones is actually down 0.1%. So I guess 2 out of 3 ain't bad, as the Meatloaf song goes, right? Let's take a look at cryptocurrencies. Okay, still down a little bit, $374 billion market cap, 5,861 coins. So you can see there's a lot of red on the board here today. So Bitcoin, while Ethereum is down quite substantially over the last 7 days. I'm focusing more now on Bitcoin. I have, after having read Robert Breedlove's article there, he convinced me that Bitcoin is perhaps the most important cryptocurrency, perhaps, or maybe the only one that we'll eventually ever need. But I think there's a place for Ethereum, certainly, perhaps some of the others, but I'm just focusing on Bitcoin now. I'm putting all my money, all my savings that I can come up with, which is not a substantial amount, but what I can. I'm now doing it into Bitcoin solely at the moment. But let's take a look at the board here. So yeah, generally red across the board, Polkadot up 30% over 24 hours. A lot of folks are saying good things about Polkadot, but I haven't got into it yet. I need to maybe understand that a little bit more before I do that. So we'll see how well Polkadot does, but there's a lot of coins to be looking at here, folks. And I would, if you were asking for my opinion, what I would recommend to new folks interested in Bitcoin is just to focus on perhaps Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies generally. Folks who are interested in cryptocurrencies, just to focus on Bitcoin. I think that's your safest bet. And then slowly maybe look at some of the others if you want to, but I think you'll do fine just with Bitcoin. All right, yeah, so nothing much happening, no big moves. Here's OMG network down substantially, but there you have it. All right, on to the online oracle, our trusty sidekick for today's most pressing question. So sticking with the idea of Bitcoin and that really great article by Robert Breedlove, I thought I would ask the online oracle the question today, which is, will Bitcoin become the world reserve currency by the end of this decade? I have no idea. I don't think so, but we'll see what it says. Signs point to yes. There you go. I mean, it would be a terrific idea if it happened, but who knows if that will happen. There's a lot of entrenched players who don't want that to happen. They want to have their own CBDC, right? The central bank digital coin based on a blockchain, but something that they can manipulate at will. Bitcoin really robs them of their power and in fact makes them useless, really. We have no need for central banksters if we had Bitcoin as a world reserve currency. Anyway, there you have it, folks. Thanks so much for joining me. It's a long one. I really encourage you to read that article if you have the moment. You probably need an hour or so. But if you're interested in Bitcoin and ways of trying to protect your wealth in the interim, as the central bankers do everything they can to rob you and I to give to the rich, the reverse of Robin Hood, then let's take a look at that. Thanks so much for joining me. Hope you appreciate that. I appreciate you spending your time with me. And I hope things are well. You've still got your job, you've got your health, and you're squirreling away some savings, paying down debt. And be kind to each other out there. And remember, at the end of the day, dum spiro, spero.